So I'll just get really quick. I was a journalist covering technology for Fortune and Wired and outlets like that for a long time. So I've gone up against the likes of Katherine and come away with bruises and bloody marks. So glad to sit next to you.
Thank you. Oh, there it is.
So
you're not afraid. Okay.
6 years at Tumblr until
until June, until right before.
I like to think of it as disappearing inside of Yahoo, but that's a rude
disappearing
comment.
inside of Verizon, inside of Yahoo, inside.
Okay.
Yeah. No. Yes, I was at Tumblr from when we were teeny tiny. 20. I was employee 25, and most of the other folks there were engineers and designers, and I was one of the first people that kind of came in from a non-technical side.
Right.
To be clear, I'm like the least technically savvy person to ever work inside a tech company. But I could fake it well enough to talk about things.
But the most communications and marketing savvy person in this room right now, I hope. We think. I'm gonna say. And so you're now at Awesomeness.
Besides you.
You're now at Awesomeness, which is a multi-platform media company.
That's correct.
And it's focused on, you guys call it Generation Z.
We do.
Is that the term of
Gen
art?
Z, yeah, I think Gen Z is like the pretty common lexicon now. It's basically the teens. So I think it's between age of like 13 to 24, and there's like a pretty wide differentiation, obviously, of the experiences of a 13-year-old and a 24-year-old, but much like how millennial kind of captured a whole range. So we create, just like a two-second primer on Awesomeness, media and entertainment company, multi-platform. We create all kinds of stuff, short form, long form, scripted, unscripted, films, TV. We have shows on Hulu and Netflix and short form. And basically the common denominator with everything is that it's all targeted specifically at Gen Z. We've been doing it for about 5 years. Not me personally, I joined in June, but it started first as a YouTube channel. So like they're very, familiar with the new way of communication with the youth.
Yeah, I just have to read some titles of some shows.
Oh, good.
That
this is fun.
You'll realize that I haven't watched. DIY nail wraps with Nikki and Gabby.
Very popular.
10 lazy girl hair hacks with Courtney Randall. So I watched that before I came on stage, and I hope.
This is your lazy girl hair hack.
All right, let's get into it. We're here to talk about marketing, communications, branding, and PR. Let's define the terms. Break down the difference and the relationship between marketing and PR.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so marketing and PR obviously should go hand in hand in an ideal situation. They should ride along next to each other, kind of spreading the gospel of whatever your company's mission statement and narrative is. And I think there's often, and I certainly experienced this when I first joined Tumblr, an assumption that like marketing and PR are the same thing.
Right. I talk to startups all the time, and they
Totally.
conflate the two.
And I think that's kind of understandable in a sense if you're just thinking of them both as having to do with the brand, and like we're talking about the brand. The difference, obviously, there's PR and communications in which you're working with reporters or journalists and you're kind of putting the brand out there in a very public way through a third party, often the press. And marketing, there's often revenue and sales assumptions that are driving that as well. And the way that I think about it also in a very like basic way is that with marketing, you're sort of controlling your message in a very specific, I'm paying for advertising here. I am like putting my message here. With PR, it's the same story, but it's through a third-party source.
External means somehow?
Exactly. So I think often people will start with PR because they think PR is free marketing. Because they're like, I don't have to pay for an ad, I don't have to pay for that. We can just get a bunch of press and then kind of try to lump them together. And the fact is, the lines have gotten really blurry. Things like social media now often fits in PR, often fits in marketing, sometimes community management. I think that they've kind of become a little bit more of these like hybrid terms, but they are different.
Right, and we're going to get to kind of the order, but I want to ask you right now, I mean, if I'm a startup and most of these people in this room are starting companies, do I think of one before the other? I mean, if I'm thinking about PR from sort of day one, am I getting ahead of myself if I don't have a marketing plan?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that thinking about either PR or marketing from day one is less important than just thinking about what is your actual story and your actual brand message from day one. PR and marketing are two different ways that you can approach how you're going to deliver that narrative. But I think that from day one, first, I'll back it up. From day one, I hope that what you're thinking about before everything else is the product.
Right.
And I'm like, putting myself out of future jobs by being like, don't think about PR at the very beginning. Don't hire a communications person at the very beginning unless you've already gotten your product on solid ground and thought about your customers and thought about your users and gotten it to a place where like there's a there. It's not all about like, let's just pitch it into existence. Like we'll just talk about it and then it'll suddenly manifest itself. So I think that's the very first step. But what we're doing when we're doing PR and marketing is really taking what is the essence of what you've built and putting it out there in the world. So I think thinking about that stuff early on and thinking about at the end of this year, what do I want people to think that my company is a really good exercise to do, regardless of whether you're ready to like go call up reporters right away.
Right, so you need this essence, you need this product before you can, but it sounds like you need to think about these things in parallel.
I think you have to think about it. I think you absolutely do. I mean, I think that the first thing I do when I get into any company or when I start talking with other folks in startups is like do basically an audit of asking everyone who works at the firm, and it could be 3 people, it could be 10 people, or it could be 50 people. Like, what is your purpose? What are you here for? Why do you exist? What are you solving in the world? I think those are all really important questions for everyone to be asking themselves. And I think the really interesting thing is that more often than not, you get 10 different answers.
Right.
And maybe there's one common denominator across all of it, and you're like, okay, there's the nugget of what we're working with here, like the one thing everyone can agree on, and now let's kind of tackle all the differences.
Do you need just one answer, and can that answer change, or does it have to change over time?
I think it will change, and it should change. My impression, I think that there should be one sort of, I both love and hate the phrase North Star, but there's a reason why people want to work for you and build something, and it's often that North Star of like, here's what we're going for. But I think that the best companies also are realistic about kind of pivoting as the market changes, or as they, maybe they started as one thing and then they realize that where they're going is a little bit different. And I think being so rigid and, we started out as this and there can't be any flexibility there can be a real killer. I think evolution is good. Like we all work in a really fast-moving, fast-changing society. It's good to have those guard lines where you say like, we represent something, we stand for this, but then the means by which you get there and the way that you talk about it has to evolve. We're living in a different world this year than we were last year.
Right. You talked about how you need to get your essence, your product down first. And oftentimes what happens with successful startups, let's put it that way, they get their product down and it just takes off, right? So, hey, this thing sells itself, and by design. So why do I need any of this stuff? Like, why do I need marketing and PR if my product's doing just fine?
I mean,
more than
good.
Fine.
First off, like, I want to be on board with that. Good for you. If you're like, just you hit it and you don't need anything. I think I'd rather have this. My personal opinion is I'd rather have some of that stuff set in place for the moment when things start to slow down, because the hockey stick usually doesn't last forever. And it's very similar to a PR lesson that I learned like very early on, which was, well, Katherine, you don't want to be calling up that reporter for the very first time when you've got a shitty story you need to kill. Like it's better to lay the groundwork early and have the relationship and have everything set up so that by the time you're getting to that like, oh no point, you're not starting from scratch. So I think of it sort of similarly, that maybe right away things are going smooth and you don't need to like come in and pay for a ton of advertising because you don't need it. But to just completely ignore all the things that marketing and PR has to offer until all of a sudden things are on the back foot, I think can be a little bit dangerous.
So what are the moments for startups that you should be preparing for, and it's kind of maybe too late if you aren't? Like, you talk to startups, they're like, oh, we're launching in a week. What can you do for me?
Oh, man.
Or a crisis happens or something.
Yeah, launching in a week, if you're launching in a week and you're, doing like a stealth launch and you're quiet and you don't care about PR, that's fine. I think launching in a week and saying, what's our media strategy? You're like 3 months late already. So, I mean, good luck. You can still do it. You can still post a beautiful post on Medium and hope that somebody picks it up and that, you don't need all of that and it's all totally well and good. I mean, I think that there are a few different things. I think you have to be realistic about sort of like the market that you're entering. And, do you have something that is lightning in a bottle and you should be thinking about this pre-launch, like getting in there super early and kind of laying out how this goes? Or, you should be first getting the product up and out there and actually growing some users and learning and kind of pivoting as you need to go and then looking around and saying, okay, I think it's time for us to make a bigger splash. I don't think that there's like a magic moment. At Tumblr, I think it was like they had already closed the Series C by the time they came and found me. And we're
wow.
oh, okay. Because it was very similar where like...
It was growing like mad.
It was growing like crazy and, it was all well and good and we don't need marketing, we don't need PR. We've got users, our users are happy and that's fine. And we've got great engineers and that's super. And then I think there's usually like a moment where either there's a tipping point of like the founder doesn't want to have to take calls from press anymore. Because often, like when you're starting your thing, like you're everything, right? Like you're selling, you're fixing code, you're actually going around and meeting with people in press and closing deals. And there gets to be a moment where you realize, like, if you can only put, 10% at best of your time into that sort of marketing, PR, brand bucket, like you're going to get 10% of the quality out of it. So I think there's often a tipping point where people start to pay attention. There's like, oh fuck, I can't. I'm sorry. I hope I can say fuck in here. You're like,
you just did.
Right? We're not like live.
He's
on,
leaving.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why. I just got so conservative. I was like, oh my god, they're gonna kick me out. But it gets to a moment where you're like, I need someone to do this and take it off my plate, which is like a totally valid reason. Or I think sometimes you realize that the ability to be objective when it's your baby is a really, really, really hard thing, especially if you're trying to build your brand and realizing that the brand for your company and like your brand as a personal founder is also part of it. And it can be, I think, really hard to sort of take a look in the mirror and be like, how am I positioning myself? Like, how should I be pitching myself? Should I be here? Should I be there? Isn't it really awkward when I have to call up these various folks and say, like, have you heard about this founder? He's amazing. Oh, it's me. Like that.
Let me pass you the phone. Yeah.
You're changing your voice all the time. You're like making your girlfriend or your boyfriend or your mom do it for you. Like that's,
So this gets to the point of like in the beginning you have to do that. And let's talk about because later when you Series C, it sounds like Tumblr had some money to go hire a proper communications team.
I was cheap then, let's be honest.
Okay, well, how do you do things without spending a lot of money, or just be realistic, how much is it going to cost if it's a launch, if it's putting together an initial marketing plan or initial communications plan?
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a range. I would say anyone who thinks like, I'm just going to get some consultant in and do it super cheap and dirty, good for you, but I've yet to find the person who's like this magic guru who can solve all this for you and be, like
cheap.
Really, really cheap. Unless you're willing to put your hope and your chances in someone who's like young and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and is just like going to go for it, which some of the best people that I've hired have been like right out of college and really smart and young. So, you've got to be willing to like take chances, but so you've got like the freelancer route, you've got the let's just hire someone in-house route, which is where I've spent most of my time. So that's like my personal advocacy would be like bring someone in-house, because I think that to understand all the nuances of your company, like it's good to have someone who sees everything day to day. You can also go with an agency, and like they're gonna, a solid like reputable PR agency could be $20K a month.
Right.
Like those are expensive. That being said, you also can do a lot of stuff on your own. When you're first starting. Like I said, I'm not someone to say like the first thing you need to do is hire a communications person. I think you can do a fair amount on your own, but
the third thing, the fifth thing, I mean, like as in terms of like numbers of employees, let's say we're 0 to 5, 0 to 10, 0 to 20. I mean, I know it's sort of an unfair question, but is there a ballpark?
well, I mean, I think like if you, it kind of goes back to all those different things I was bringing up in the beginning of like, where are you in your in your product, in your story? I mean, like I said, Tumblr was 25. They probably could have brought in me a little bit earlier, but anything earlier than that, I might have been like sitting around not being as useful because they were just in like build, grow mode. If you're bringing in someone at like 3 or 4, then you must really have a story to tell.
Right.
Like you must really know that you're sitting on something that is going to be huge.
Can it be that, or can it be that you're just not very good at telling your story? And how do
that's
you
fair.
talk to founders who aren't good at it, honestly?
And that is totally fair. And if you are a founder who realizes your weaknesses early on, then I think that you're already like way far ahead of a lot of folks.
Right.
Because I think that can be the hardest thing is realizing like what are your.
Yeah, we were told in the VC panel that everybody in New York is brilliant at branding and communication, so I'm sure it won't be a
Really?
problem for any of you guys.
All right, never mind. Just panel over. Like you guys already have it. You know, it's funny. I think that like in many situations, one of the best things you can do is be a good listener, like across the board. And I think especially when dealing with founders, you have to listen to them. You have to listen to the way they talk about themselves, the way they talk about their company, the way they talk about, you know, how they're killing it, and the things that they leave out and don't talk about, which are often like the fears and the weaknesses that they don't bring up. And you have to be intuitive and know how to push and encourage, and then also, you know, say you did a really great job, you did a really, but then also give like the tough feedback. So I think like some of this is just, are you like a naturally intuitive and inquisitive and also kind of comforting presence? Because like we all know that being a founder can be incredibly challenging. So when it comes to just getting my CEO or executive comfortable and out there, I think that there's a part of it that's like that intangible, just tell me your story, and the more you repeat it, the easier it's going to be, and the easier that will be to kind of extract what we should be talking about. There are also, you know, there are plenty of people who do this professionally, and like if you can't, I will say, like if you can't hire a communications person right off the bat, you could totally hire a media consultant for like a one-day thing and have someone come in and do media training with you, and like it will be incredibly uncomfortable unless you just like love it. Unless you're like me and you went to school for theater and you're like, put the camera on me and like just let's go. For most people, it's really uncomfortable, and they'll ask you hard questions and they'll just drill it into your head, but you'll leave that session with usually a clearer sense of how to talk about you and your brand, and with some skills to get out there. So I do encourage that. And like, you know, it's funny, when I started at Tumblr, I think David was like, he was maybe 23, 24, and he was like, I'm not really gonna do press.
This is the founder of Tumblr.
Well, yes, the founder of Tumblr, sorry, David Karp. He was like, I'm not really gonna do press. Like, I'm not really gonna be like the person that's out there on panels. And I was just like, and like my wheels were like, sorry, dude, like you're gonna do all those things. But okay, we'll do it at your pace. And we did it at his pace. And I remember we had everyone needs like an aha moment. Like I think he had an aha moment when we had gone to a conference, I think it was in Virginia, that Richard Branson was speaking at. And you know, very like enigmatic and personality driven. And he had sort of like a moment of like, oh, you know, Richard can just get out there and talk about something, and people will write about it and research it and care about it, versus like Virgin doing a big ad somewhere, and it sounds so basic at the time, but it's like you kind of needed to, I think, realize and recognize the value in why getting out there and like being the face and repeating your story over and over is meaningful. And it takes everyone a various amount of time, but having someone like me to force you to do it sometimes the thing that pushes it.
What are the elements of a good story and
Conflict.
conflict? I mean, well, you tell me. Like, what are the elements of a good story, and how? This sounds like a horrible question coming from a former journalist, but how real does it need to be?
How real does it need to be?
Yeah.
I mean, it can't be bullshit. You can't lie.
All right, I agree with you, but
You can't lie.
So what are the
like
elements
this, like
of a good story?
my number one rule. You can't. Anyone who tells you just like say whatever and just like make it up and we'll deal with it later. First of all, they're setting you as like the messenger up to just ruin your reputation. You can never lie to a journalist. You shouldn't really lie in general. Like, didn't your mother tell you that? But obviously, there are things that you can emphasize more than other things.
Right.
But just like rule of thumb, in case anyone is encouraging you to just bullshit your way through all this, I highly discourage it. So obviously, conflict is something that definitely makes a good story. I mean, I think the number one thing that you can all do is read a lot, read the news that's coming out, and there are obviously things that you'll see. There are trends that you and your story either fit into or, kind of are debunking or have like an interesting riff on something that is happening today. And like that's the best thing you can do is if you have an original message, but it fits into a larger societal context. I mean, it definitely is conflict. I'm thinking just about like our president and all the press that he gets, and it's all just for, inflaming what's happening in the world and
Right.
using it to his own advantage. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Don't. Here's the other thing that will get you press sometimes, but not the right kind too, is just like being disparaging to everybody else. I think sometimes people take this approach.
Well, so how do you talk about the competition then, or do you? And if you are, give us an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have just always taken the position of like, don't disparage your competition, don't talk shit on other people, and like, why would you want to give them that much space in your story anyway? I think you can talk in broad terms about, where you fit in the landscape of competitors without being like, we're this, but not as, and then just like rant. Or, it's good sometimes to talk about where you aspire to be in terms of bigger, more established companies, I think, who have kind of paved the way that like clearly are not there yet, but we see ourselves in a similar vein. But there are some people that, don't mind just throwing flames around at other people, and I just don't think that it ever pays off in the long run. And that stuff haunts you, too. Like, the internet is forever. Like,
right.
It obviously all comes full circle, and people will love to pick on that little piece out of what might have been, like, a really, really insightful, really thoughtful comment, but, like, the second that you turn around and start talking shit, like, okay, there's your quote.
So I like three things. Don't lie, we got that. Don't throw flames. Yeah. What's a third thing that, a founder or any young company should never do?
I think don't be overly humble. And that might be contradictory to some of, what I think about on a day-to-day human basis, but I think that it's great to be the nice guy, and it's great to be just in service to your users and in service to your team and all of that. But there's also an element of like, just don't let yourself become only the subtext of your story, and like not really own what you're about and be proud of it and kind of beat your chest a little bit. I think that I'm kind of like,
Are there companies that do a good job of that, that come to mind, or brands for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are.
Because it's a subtle thing.
It is subtle. It is subtle. I don't know if it's like the most helpful thing, but I think that even if you look at big platforms like Instagram, like there are a million Instagram stars, and that's wonderful, and they get all the attention and all the love, but everyone knows why they're famous, and it's because there's this massive platform that has helped propel them to give them that opportunity. so I think like as much as you want to lift up your users and your clients and your staff, just like don't forget to remind everyone that they're there because of you and what you've built and what you've put out there. Like, don't just put yourself in the back seat at all times, because it's more natural and it feels like it's the nice thing to do.
But you can over rotate on that as well and put yourself.
You can be an asshole too. Yeah, it's true.
That's the way to
I
put
think
it.
it's like it's hard. Yeah, this is why people often think that like this is a very easy thing to do. Like I had someone once say, well, don't you just pick up the phone and call people and sound really excited, and then when you're really excited, they just assume that whatever you're saying is great. I was like, no, that's fundamental. You'll sound insane if you do that. Like if I just called you and was like, oh my God, we're doing Nikki and Gabby's hair apps, you'd be like, this girl's lost her mind. Yeah. So I think that like I've heard like, I don't love the terminology, but I've definitely heard PR and marketing and comms referred to as like a dark art. It's very like, it's subtle and it's behind the scenes and like a little bit evil. It's not 100% wrong.
That sounds, well, don't lie, don't bullshit, and don't sound insane. That sounds pretty
Don't sound
straight.
insane,
Yeah.
and don't be afraid to like, to really put your brand out in front.
One of the things that Mackenzie and Katherine worked together at Tumblr, and one of the things that Mackenzie said that he really appreciated was that you would do an internal kind of summary of all the coverage, and it kind of brought people up to speed and got them excited. So most startups don't think about their internal marketing or sort of their internal communications. When do I start that, and how do I go about that in any different way from my external ambition?
Totally. I did do that, and it was to get people excited and to remind them of like all this great stuff that we had just done. But I think it was also the third thing was really to put it in context, because I think often when people would like see an article of like, Tumblr did whatever, they didn't necessarily know the greater context of like, here's why we worked with this outlet and here's why this story is important, because like our overall narrative is blah. So like some of it was also just like this repetitive, it goes back to like repetition is a big theme for me, this repetitive, like if you just keep reminding people what they're here for and the way we're positioned, it'll mean something. I personally think that companies should start this probably earlier than what feels natural. So at Tumblr, when Mackenzie and I were there, I think we started it, I want to say when we were like around 40 people, which I probably would have started it earlier. I heard somewhere that it was like the first 20 to 25 employees is when like your culture gets like locked in. So I probably would have started more around that area. It's a good opportunity to bring everyone together, to just make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone's celebrating the wins, because like obviously we all know there are really great days and then they can be followed by really rough days. And I'm a big fan of like celebrate it, little or small or big, like get out there and celebrate it. And just repeating it to make sure that everyone is kind of speaking the same gospel. So I would start it early. I would start with 20 people. Like do it once a week. If that's way too much, start off like once a month then, and get everyone around. And it also just like becomes something you look forward to. It becomes something you expect. And then, it shouldn't just be the kind of thing where people are only getting together when there's either like really scary news or like really good news, or you're like, we sold the company, or like this person's leaving. Like there should be other formalized means of communication amongst the company, I think, before you get to that point.
So if you get people inspired and excited, I think one of the kind of secondary effects is that they're sort of too excited and inspired and they start speaking out of school. So how do you control, I don't like saying the word control, but let's talk about how you control the message, and for that matter,
the messenger.
Partner with the media to make sure that people are saying the right things and people are not speaking if they're not supposed to.
Yeah. I was sharing this prior that I think I got sort of an undeserved reputation at Tumblr of being the person who on your first day would come up to you and be like, oh my God, so nice to meet you. I'm so glad you're here. Don't ever talk to the media. Do not respond. Email me. Like I was just so, because it's true, the point we were making is that often, you're working with very excited, sometimes very young, sometimes a little bit inexperienced folks who are just like going out there and talking, and they're excited and they're sharing, and they're not necessarily understanding that like maybe this is proprietary knowledge, or like maybe this is we're saving this story for the right moment. So I do think that setting those ground rules and making sure everyone knows the way that media works is important, and town hall type situations or these weekly meetings are probably perhaps a better way to do it than my like terrifying, like I will come find you if you,
Right.
if you speak out of turn. But it is something you have to think about that usually people don't until it sort of bites them, when all of a sudden someone goes, oh, I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to tweet that. Because like I wasn't thinking that tweeting something is the same as like going on CNBC, but in this world, like media is media, social media, digital media, print, like it's just media, it's all out there. So I think setting those expectations and those rules early is really important, because on the flip side, like you have all these excited folks who you want to lift up to have evangelize, but you just want to do it in a structured way. So, you know, and I'm doing a similar exercise at Awesomeness. Like the company is 5 years old, but there hasn't always been this structure. They've never had a me. They've never had, you know, anyone doing communications and corporate social responsibility and that stuff. So I think a lot about like, how do we make sure that everyone's on the same page, everyone's excited? How do I find ways to lift people up and get them out there more, but without ruining like the special
Right.
culture, without being oppressive? That's hard. I think having a venue where people can talk and they feel like they're equally as invested in the company as the people up top are is really important to do that. And lifting up and celebrating, you know, folks who might be, you know, not always celebrated for the work that they do is also really important. And it builds a lot of goodwill, so that then when you're like, hey, you gotta take it easy on your
Right.
social, like you know, they don't feel like they're being oppressed.
You talk about a tweet, and maybe it's speaking out of turn to a reporter, but that gets me to crisis. And startups at some level are a fragile thing. So I'm a large company, a product launch doesn't go so well, we have to recall something, God forbid, but you know, large companies can absorb that. That will oftentimes kill a startup. So there's a crisis at a startup. What do you do first? And what do you do second? And
Yeah.
what do you not do for that matter?
I feel like what to not do is probably the easiest thing to tackle first. There was like that saying, you know, if it's hot, don't sit on it.
Yeah, it makes sense,
Right?
actually.
So if there's a crisis, yeah, and then you're like, well, like I'm gonna go home and think about it, or I'm like go to drinks, or I'm gonna, you know, like freak out about it internally for, you know, a few hours before I start to tell people. And it's like speed is gonna be your friend here. So I think gathering like your closest allies and your sort of like need to know crew is really important to get on that really fast and to formulate whatever you need to do as quickly as possible. So if it's a response, it's like, obviously we gotta get together, and you don't wanna you wanna have the severity of the situation be like appropriately addressed, but you also don't wanna sound like you had me write it, probably. You wanna sound genuine, and you wanna sound human, and you wanna sound like you as the founder are invested. If it's something truly that is like impacting everyone across the board, we're not talking about like a little issue, we're talking about a big one. I think that it needs to go all the way up to the top and feel like you're taking it seriously. And obviously, like, if you can fix it, then it's a smaller crisis than if the whole thing is sideways. So I think communicating early and often and updating people if it's something that is still like kind of in the works is gonna save you, because it's about goodwill with your consumers and your audience. So
Is there an example of a crisis that you've seen or experienced that was, you know, masterfully done? And it doesn't have to be by you, but
that's a good one. I feel like I should have something good on hand. I don't know. I feel like there's just I want to come back to this because I'm sure I'm going to come up with something, but I feel like the folks that get out fast and are genuine and human you can often diffuse
Right.
the initial swirl of, like, everyone will just assume the worst. I mean, my other, like, rule of thumb with most things is if there's any room for misinterpretation, you should over communicate and over clarify. Like, you don't want to kind of put your statement or your response out there and be like, I think most people will get it. Like, if it's a little bit, if there's any possible way that it can be twisted the wrong way, somebody will. So be precise and be clear, and even if it feels like it's maybe like a step too far, I would say over communicate rather than like leave any room for further interpretation out there.
And does it always have to be the founder? I mean, it depends on the size of the company, I suppose, but is it always the founder?
No, I mean, it definitely just depends on the size of the company. I mean, I think if we're talking about a crisis that is like truly impacting your whole user base or impacting a serious amount of your clients, I think it means the most coming from the founder. I mean, I think like being a founder is a true honor, and it has a special weight that it carries with it, and it has a special amount of genuineness that comes with it. So it doesn't mean that you have to go it alone and that there aren't people behind the scenes like helping you, craft what you're going to say or fix it or whatever. But I think it means something when the founder steps up. I think it means something especially when they step up and say, we screwed up. Like, right. I'm really sorry.
What about when things are going well? Because founders are incredibly busy. Like you say, you don't want them spending all their time on PR and communications, I don't think. So when can they step away and kind of hand things off, or at least not be as involved?
Yeah. I think as soon as the founder and whoever's doing PR kind of can get into that mind meld of like, there's a lot of trust, obviously, that has to happen between the two roles. And there has to be an understanding that like we're speaking the same language. I don't think the founder should be just sort of like oppressively hovering over every single thing, because you don't want to be that person also. Like you need to trust your team, and you need to know like where your time you better spent. And as I mentioned earlier, like if you know what you're not good at, that's like even better to allow people to do their jobs. So I think that there's definitely, once there's that trust and that kind of like Vulcan mind meld thing, like you can step away a little bit. But then, as I mentioned, I kind of used David Karp as an example with this, like there are going to be moments where it's you, like we're going to get way further if I have you out there either doing this interview or speaking at this conference, which is a great way to get out there and get your story out there and socialize with the media and with other founders. And you have to trust that like if your person is telling you like this is worth your time and it's going to help move the needle, that it's worth putting aside probably the thing you're more excited to do, because I feel like most people are more excited to like build the thing than to just go out there and talk about it. But there are moments when it's really worth putting that aside and getting out there and speaking your truth.
I know I have plenty of questions, but I want you guys to have time to ask questions too. So if there are questions in the audience, and there are, let's have some. I'll tell you, Airbnb, I just want to say one crisis that they did well. Airbnb, when there was a woman's apartment flat in San Francisco, got trashed. They were kind of paralyzed for a day or two, and then they came out with, we will guarantee any mishap in your home, and things went really well from there.
Well, and that's a good point, that like if you can come back not just with the I'm sorry, but also like here's the thing, here's the Band-Aid, here's the thing that we're going to do moving forward, then obviously that's the best situation.
Hey, so Katherine, question for you. I know you mentioned, I think it was like in the middle of the conversation, that not to be an ass and like not to pick fights and whatnot, and you also mentioned our president. But besides that, my question is, I've noticed a lot in marketing and in PR and communication in general, companies do pick fights. They pick fights with their competitors. They do trash talk them. They actually do it on public television. They do it all the time. So what's your take on that? Like,
there's that notion that you should always have an enemy.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
Maybe I'm too nice. I think, listen, like, we went back to saying, yeah, if you want to get attention, obviously, like I said, conflict is one of the core things. If you're picking a fight with someone, it's going to get picked up, and people are going to follow it, and people are going to, like, live for it. I personally don't ascribe to all press is good press, and I also think that having a truth and a story that can stand on its own without just being in opposition to somebody else is a good thing. That's not to say like you don't have competitors and you don't have people that you judge yourself against, because also that can be a good motivator for people too. But I personally am like, if you're an asshole and you're out there publicly, like it'll come back eventually. And I could be, you know, someone who thinks this, and 10 other people will sit up here and say like, I disagree with you, and that's fine. But that's my POV on all of it.
I had a question on, most of your examples were consumer sort of products. Is there any significant difference or change to PR strategy for B2B sort of situations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, my sort of like love affairs with more consumer products, so it's probably where I gravitate more towards, although Tumblr was interesting in that we had the B2B space, we had the B2C, we had, we started doing more in policy related. I mean, I think a lot of it is similar. Your outlets are a little bit different. Maybe your clients versus your customers or your users are a little bit different. But I think the same basic principles of like, what do we want to be known for? How do we fit within our competitive set? Like, are we solving a problem? It still holds true, like no matter kind of what industry you're in or what your approach is. And I had something else that I just lost. Yes, I think it's still very relatable.
I would say from a journalist media perspective, like your job to tell your story is even harder because there's not a lot of people in the media world who maybe understand what you do. It's not as easily kind of dramatic or tension-filled as a consumer thing. And so I think enterprise and kind of B2B companies need to work even harder on being crisp and kind of more evocative of your story when you tell it.
That's a good point. But it also makes it easier perhaps to find those first few media journalists and publications that you need to start to get to know.
Yeah, and
Like
if you
you're
do a
not-
good job,
yeah.
people will love you for it,
Right. You at least have you're like, this is the bucket I'm starting with.
You have a question back here?
What would you say is the trigger between marketing and sales, actual sales? And also, could you address, say, if you had capital to launch a marketing campaign, would you do a magazine launch before you bring in PR, or how would you go?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess I'm biased, but I don't think a marketing launch without having PR at least considered and kind of baked into it will be like fully the most effective. I think that if you're going to do a whole marketing splash, like you're probably also thinking that PR should be a big part of that story, so they probably want to be a little more hand in hand. Not to say maybe you don't care about the PR piece of it, but I think that they're often, if you're launching, I would kind of put the two of them together.
Question. In regards to marketing and PR, what is your view on the future of digital media, and also what is the rate of return if you decide to go with a specific marketing? Say you want to go to magazine, or you want to go to television, or maybe social media. What is the rate of return? I would say your ROI.
Now you're asking for my ROI.
Yeah.
It's a tough.
How do I know it's working?
That's like one of the hardest. It's a hard question. Well, and I think part of it is too, like you've got to think about your audience that you're trying to reach too, and like what your goals are. And I think that's you have to have that before you're thinking like, am I doing a magazine? Am I doing social? Am I doing this? Because if you don't know, who your audience is, then who knows? Like toss it all up in the air and who knows how it's going. And I think it depends also on like the larger goals of the company, whether are you trying to grow your user base? Are you trying to retain talent? Are you trying to raise capital? Because then those are probably different levers that you're pulling kind of depending on what those considerations are. So, I mean, there are a few different things. It's like, if it's marketing stuff that might be, actually tied to revenue and sales related. PR, I think is, personally, I think my biggest pain point is like, it can be hard to measure. And the various services that sort of say like, this is what we do, I don't think that there's a perfect solution. Obviously, buzz and obviously, caliber of media can mean something. Again, it goes back to like, if you're trying to reach a specific audience, then actually like TechCrunch might be more important to you than the Wall Street Journal. And it's not just about hard numbers necessarily of like how many people saw it or how many people read it. So that's the part that I always find is a little bit of like, you have to understand the nuance of all these different outlets and different publications and different approaches before you can just say like, was that effective?
Yeah, I mean, if you're an enterprise company and there's 5 possible, customers in the world, how am I going to reach them? So you want to spend your money there, and there's, examples of companies like that. If I'm Airbus, how do I do marketing?
Right.
Suppose that you are a very small startup and your competitor is a big company like Facebook. How would you
hope they
appro-
buy you? Isn't that just how it works now?
No, but how would you approach the marketing so they don't, the moment you come on the radar, they can go and replicate your product?
Yeah, honestly, one of the things that, maybe I'm in the wrong place to say this, one of the things that frightens me a little bit about the future is that there's gonna be like 5 companies and that's it. It's gonna be like Amazon, Facebook, Google, and like how do you exist as a really
Yahoo?
tiny,
No, Verizon, sorry.
Very funny. Yeah, I think I think it's tricky, right? I mean, so how do you differentiate yourself when you're teeny tiny is a really tough one. I mean, I think I hope that you have like a really interesting angle and a really interesting, position in the space. And I think that you probably got to just go full steam ahead and hope that you can make as much noise as you can in sort of a short period of time. If you've got like a limited amount of time before they come breathing down your neck. But I think it's actually one of the things that I find like a little bit challenging and frightening.
I wonder, though, historically, if GM thought that too, right? Like, there's going to be 5 companies in the world, and we're going to be one of them. We'll see.
It's true.
In terms of internal communication in early stage companies, what could be the main challenges that companies could face?
For internal communication?
Yeah.
I think that the assumption that because you're small that everybody knows that what you're doing, what your goals are, and that everyone is assuming the same things and speaking about the company in the same way. I think that there is often the perception of like, if we can see everyone in the same room at all times, then we all must be sharing a brain, and we're all like clearly aligned on what the goals are and how we talk about who we are. And I found that's just like not always the case. And that, people more often than not are kind of, even when you're in a small company, are sort of heads down in their own world and aren't necessarily all connected. So I think that's one of the big opportunities is just to like very early on get everybody kind of on board and get people motivated to feel that ownership as much as the founder does, because to be like an early stage employee is a pretty exciting thing. So I think that's one of the challenges. And I think it goes back to sort of what I was saying before with like very excited, very, young, like let's just roll up our sleeves and do it all, that like you might not always understand like the rules and the boundaries of just how and when we should be talking about the company and like when it's appropriate, when it's not. And those are like not the fun things. Like nobody wants to be like setting rules in place, but all of that stuff will help you so much more when you're 100 people and when you're 150 people, when you've already established kind of what you're all about. And I also think like not glorifying, complete and utter burnout early on too. Like they don't want your culture to be one that just is all about like just work until you drop. I think that's just something that in this industry is often like just go for it and don't make sure that you're taking time to make sure that the team is healthy and okay. And so I would just say like setting that up early on, making sure that you're as best you can, like offering, holistic care for your companies and your employees just means a lot.
Questions? Anyone else? I have one last question. What can everybody in this room, we can walk out, including myself, and do, what's one thing we can do to kind of get this ball moving?
Okay, if you're only going to do one thing.
Or it could be two, but.
If you're on, take an improv class. I'm not kidding. Take an improv class. I think that there's, and like again, I hinted to it earlier that like I, in a past life, was a theater kid. There's nothing more terrifying than standing on stage and not having any idea what the words are that are about to come out of your mouth. You're going to find yourself in that situation time and time again, whether it's sitting up here and having someone ask you a question that you're like, I have no idea, or sitting across from a gentleman, like the one sitting next to me, who's going to ask you something really hard, and you're like, I got to think on my feet, and I've got to feel confident in doing so. Or when you're, looking to start hiring employees and they're, pushing you to ask questions about your company, like you want to have that solid ground of being able to be confident, speak confidently, think on your feet, and be a little bit fearless. And I think that just take one. You don't have to do a ton unless you find that you like really, really love it. It's an unorthodox tip, but it has never steered me wrong. And I think that it would be my one recommendation.
That's awesome. Don't lie, don't be insane, take improv. Katherine Barna, thank you so much.
Thank you.